Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we'll be talking about non-alcoholic beer. We're trying to include everyone in our events and in our classes, and for those people who don't drink, do not fret, there is a drink for you. If you want to have that same flavor as beer, if you want to have that same experience as other people who drink beer, there is non-alcoholic beer. And just to be clear, non-alcoholic beer has 0.5% alcohol or less. So it could be 0.5 alcohol or less, and this is what the FDA approves. Since there's not much alcohol in the beer or none at all, there's a risk of pathogens going inside your home brew. Therefore, you want to be careful when making it, and we want to make sure that your pH is lower than 4.6 or even better, lower than 3.9. And how do you test pH? It's with pH strips. So I got this honestly at a cheap price at Amazon. It was $1. And what you have to do, you just have to dip it inside your liquid. It's going to tell you the amount of pH based on the color that your band is. It's going to tell you the pH number of the non-alcoholic beer. If you want to adjust your pH, you can add calcium carbonate. However, this typically increases pH. There are other methods that you can use to decrease your pH, and they are the following. I just like to say that to increase my pH, before I used to add baking powder to my batch and it affected the flavor of the homebrew, so I do not suggest adjusting pH with baking powder. If you have any suggestions on how to increase pH without affecting the flavor of your alcohol, drop them in the comment below. And once your pH is set, you want to make sure that when you look at the starting gravity of your non-alcoholic beer, it is at 1.005. And this is because when doing your calculations, this is the maximum amount of starting gravity that is allowed for non-alcoholic beer. If you have a higher starting gravity, this will be considered regular beer. So what does this 1.005 represent? It's the amount of sugar inside your batch. And for those who want to compare it to another liquid, water is at 1.000. So if non-alcoholic beer is at 1.005, this is a very low quantity of alcohol present inside your liquid. And how do you make alcohol? For those that are wondering, there are 3 simple ingredients. You just need water, you need yeast, and you need sugar. And since we're having a little bit of alcohol, you will still need these ingredients to make non-alcoholic beer. The sugar that I would use personally is white sugar. Other homebrewers might use other types of sugar to make their non-alcoholic beer. However, white sugar works. Just make sure that it's put in a small quantity. Another ingredient to make beer, and this is strictly for beer, is hops. If you'd like to make cider or wine, do not use hops because hops are what specifically give you that bitterness, that beer flavor that you drink when drinking beer. And since we're not adding a lot of sugar, I would not add more than half an ounce of hops. And hops come from a plant. They look like rabbit food. Once they're no longer in a plant form, they're in little pellets. They're green, and for those that have tasted it, it's disgusting. I would not recommend eating hops on its own. So you're making non-alcoholic beer. You boil the hops inside the water, add a little bit of sugar, and you add the yeast. For the yeast, I typically use brewer's yeast or other yeast specifically for beer, but there is yeast for non-alcoholic beer. This is the yeast for non-alcoholic beer. And drop a comment below and let me know, for those that make non-alcoholic beer, do you use regular beer yeast or non-alcoholic yeast? And one aspect of homebrewing is having an airlock. So you want to make sure that once you're making alcohol, that doesn't explode, because when you make alcohol, a byproduct is CO2. So this is little gas that's formed when mixing sugar, water, and yeast. And for non-alcoholic beer, the trick is you should not use an airlock because there's so little sugar and so little yeast. You want to make sure to conserve the CO2 inside the jar to make that fizz of the non-alcoholic beer. So that's the main difference. Do not use an airlock when making non-alcoholic beer. And this is trial and error to know what non-alcohol beer recipe you'd like to use. However, to avoid watery flavors, you can avoid starchy malt, you can avoid starchy grain, and opt for flake oats or flake wheat. And when it comes to making the non-alcoholic beer, so you have to boil the hops, and I would Boil it for 30 minutes just to make sure they're all dissolved inside the wort. And fermentation typically lasts 3 to 5 days. So the more sugar you put inside your homebrew, the longer it takes for your fermentation. This is why typically 12% wine takes longer to ferment than 4% beer. And a side note, I've noticed that when mixing up my ingredients, people prefer homebrew where there's less sugar. So one pro tip is if you're not sure about the flavor of your beer, your cider, or your wine, try adding less sugar. It gives it a more sophisticated taste and make sure that it's not too sweet for people drinking it. Going back to non-alcoholic beer, once the fermentation is done after the 3 to 5 days, a tip is to force carbonate because there's not a lot of fizz, because there's not a lot of sugar and yeast interaction. Therefore, forced carbonation is a way to go, and I have to try carbonating it with carbonation drops. Since carbonation drops are just sugar, will this transform the non-alcoholic beer to actual beer? Questions that need answers. Let me know in the comments below if you're able to carbonate your non-alcoholic beer with carbonation drops, or can this potentially add too much alcohol to your non-alcoholic beer? And in terms of flavoring, some might add a peel of orange just to put a bow on their non-alcoholic beer. So I would suggest to have multiple tries of making non-alcoholic beer because it's a tough one to master, and I will be making one shortly and will give you feedback on how it went. Speaking of beers, it's almost October and we're in the pumpkin spice season. So have any of you tried pumpkin spice beer? I have pumpkin spice over here and debating if I should just make beer and put the pumpkin spice once the fermentation is done to add flavoring, or I can add cinnamon, nutmeg, so all these separate ingredients, and add pumpkin puree and mix it from scratch. So let me know in the comments below if A, you'd like no part in pumpkin spice beer, or if I should choose the easy way to do it, or the hard way, which is getting all the ingredients separately. And if you found this video valuable, share with a friend, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And follow us on Instagram. We post more on that platform, and looking forward to seeing you in the next video.